chat. Okay, so for a long time I have been promising to do more videos. I am not at my home. This is not my PC, it's my husband's PC, and obviously autofocus is a pain in the butt, so we need to fix that. Don't do autofocus. That is a pain in the bum. I hope that's pretty focused. Okay. So, for a long time I've been trying to get back to doing videos. I don't have my own equipment. I'm sitting here on my husband's PC, which while is hardly a dud, it doesn't have all my stuff and all my bells and whistles that I'm used to, and I'm trying a new broadcaster called Game Show, which is surprisingly cheap and has a lot of little things you can do. I think it's better than XSplit, a lot cheaper anyway. Yeah, I've been experimenting with it while playing games this weekend, but I hope it gets better. I've always said that you don't understand me unless you know what a third culture child is. So I thought I would break this into three sort of parts. What the general definition of a third culture child is. I'm not exactly a child anymore. I think I'm turning 47 this year. But, you know, we all still feel like kids continually. So that's just the way it is. And I guess I'll talk about what a third culture child is, what the problems with that definition are, and then talk about how it applies to me, I guess, was what I thought I would, how I thought I'd do it. Feel free to ask me questions in chat. I think this is slightly delayed, but if you can't make it to the live, please go ahead and what would I call it? In the comments or on Twitter, ask me questions and I'll try to address them a little better. So a little while ago, a few years actually, a friend that I went to high school with in Scotland told me about a book called Third Culture Children and how he thought I would find it really, really interesting. Because we grew up, went to high school together in Aberdeen in Scotland. He was a military brat, I guess you'd call him, and we were oil field trash kids. Many years later, a lot of us have started to discover that we're not like other people when we come back into society where we're not kids anymore and not traveling on our parents' whim. And he alerted me to the fact that there's actually such a thing as a third culture child, I guess, is what it was. So, a third culture child, I thought I would just show you the Wikipedia page here. I think it's showing up in the dashboard. I put the link down in the notes when I actually schedule this in, but it basically says that a third culture child, a TCI, is a term used to refer to children raised in a culture other than their parents. Okay, so raised in a culture other than their parents, or the country, or a culture of the country given in the child's passport, where they are legally considered native, for a significant part of their early development years. There's a big argument about what early development years are. And they're exposed to a great variety of cultural influences. For adults who have had this experience as children, we're now adult third culture children, ATCK for those acronym lovers out there. Um, uh, this article needs attention, blah, blah, blah. They move between cultures before they've had an opportunity to develop their own cultural identity. So, funnily enough, we do develop cultural identities, as I'm sure you guys know from how you've developed yourself. I mean, most of my friends now define themselves either as Americans, as New Zealanders, as Norwegians, or Aussies, or most of them know how to define themselves. The thing about a third culture child is that we find it a little bit more difficult to box ourselves in. And I'd like to address that more, how it applies to me individually, and how it's difficult to make it more of a generalized term. But it started when there were a lot of American citizens working abroad. So obviously this is not an American phenomenon. Obviously there are people who live between cultures all over the place. But it's especially prevalent, I think, with people who have been raised in a diplomatic culture, in military culture overseas, where you get moved around a lot, and in the oil patch. The petroleum industry and the mining industry tends to move people around a lot. So the general characteristics, according to Wikipedia, is that third culture individuals can be referred to as cultural hybrids, cultural chameleons, and global nomads. They are particularly adept at building relationships with other cultures while not possessing that cultural identity themselves. I'll get back to that, I hope. This is... it's also for people who have lived abroad for extended periods of times. There are benefits and challenges. It's hard sometimes to remember the benefits, and it's hard for people to see the challenges because you don't seem that different. Okay, so benefits. You have an expanded worldview, yes. There's a third-dimensional view of the world. You have a hands-on experience with cultures that others don't necessarily. There is an interpersonal sensitivity, although it tends to be very one-sided as far as I can tell. There's a cultural intelligence, and they are much more able to adapt to new situations and new cultures than monocultural children. I'm not sure that's true, but... the challenges are confused loyalties. There's an interpersonal sensitivity, and I will address that. There is an identity crisis. There's a sense of conflicting loyalties. There is a sense of guilt. A serious and very real lack of a feeling of identity, I would say. And there is there's a difficulty in getting a sense of belonging that most people who are not raised in a multicultural third culture. They call it a third culture. And you are discriminated against in just about every culture that you go to, including your home culture. And there is a difficulty in developing emotional relationships or feeling like you get an emotional relationship in itself. There's a psychological effect, apparently. There's a difficulty in finding identity. Authoritarianism measures have been used by researchers, and high scores have been found in right-wing authoritarian scale, which does not fit me. There's a lot of research done on diplomatic children, and there's an intellectual effect, apparently. So, okay, so that's Wikipedia. There's also a book, and I just cannot find her name or the name of the book right now, but it's Ruth Hill, Third Culture Kids. My friend Eric probably has that much more readily at hand. Like I said, I don't mind you asking questions, but it might be easier for you after I go through why I think the definitions are hard. So this is how lumping kids who basically, okay, so your parents are, say, American, or say Thai, or say English, a lot of them English, or in my case Norwegian. They raise you mostly out of the country that they identify with, and then drag you back to the country they identify with at every chance they get, where you don't fit right in because you haven't grown up there really. And then they drag you around, and you have these expectations from your family and your culture that you are born into, that you will adapt to that culture, and then you go back to the culture where you go to school, or where you have friends, or where you have social interactions, and you're expected to be like them. And it's natural for kids to not like things that are different, so you try to adapt, and the more you move, the more you sort of become this chameleon and feel the pressures of conforming to both sides, the expectations of your parental culture or cultures, and the expectations from the culture that you desperately want to fit into, like most kids do. I think this is especially true if there is a language barrier. There's a very real different personality to multilingual children, especially multilingual adults, especially if you're bilingual completely. There's a different personality depending on which language you speak. It's subtle, but there's a difference. And there's one that you usually feel more comfortable with. So that's one aspect. There are kids who go when they are exposed to a third culture. A lot of military brats, for lack of a more common term, tend to me to seem to not integrate as much into the culture they move into. American military bases tend to be very centralized places where people sort of hang out and can stay among all their American friends. This is my experience with military bases, apart from one that I interacted with in Scotland, where they actually shipped the kids from an Air Force base quite far south of us up to my private school in Aberdeen, when there was an oil slump and the school needed more income, and they negotiated a deal with the Air Force base there. And those kids were all of a sudden exposed to Scotland in a different way than they were just on the base, although even within an American school in Aberdeen, there's a tendency to stick to the American culture and not to integrate into the more sort of Scottish culture. So all people's experiences are different, and it's hard to describe all third culture kids as the same, and I suspect I may have made my kids fourth culture children, whatever that is. But the idea is that you have a culture that you are native to, you have a culture that you're living in, and then you blend that into a third culture that's your unique culture, and that very few people can actually identify with. And when you grow up, it's funny to see how people that I grew up with have either coped with it, ran with it, escaped back to one culture, or stayed with the other culture, or sort of never really grasped either one. So all I can talk about is my personal experience in third culturedom and how it impacted me. Despite what it sounds like, my native tongue is Norwegian. My parents are both Norwegian. You know, Norway, the country, it's up there. It's Scandinavia. It has the fjords. Good at skiing. Born and bred as far back in my family history and family tree as you can look. West coast of Norway, very uniform, about as Viking as you get. But my mom and dad, after they got married, got an opportunity to study in Rapid City, South Dakota. And my mom came with my dad, and they had me while I was there. So, that makes me a U.S. citizen. Well, American is probably the least thing I feel. And they hung out with the Association of Norwegian Students Abroad, so they kept the Norwegian culture, which is a very, very, very closed culture, very nationalistic culture, very steeped in tradition culture. They all kept their Norwegian friends, with a few American ones here and there, with the expectation that you celebrate the Norwegian holidays together, you keep the Norwegian traditions together, and you are always planning to go back to Norway, so I was raised as a Norwegian living in an American. That's not meant to happen. What just happened? In an American environment, but where I was expected to go back to Norway. As it happened, we never sort of permanently went back to Norway. So my first schooling, my first preschools, everything was in American cultures. But every opportunity, you go back to Norway, you keep the Norwegian traditions, you have the Norwegian birthday cakes, you have the Norwegian this, you have the Norwegian that, you speak Norwegian at home, you speak English out, and so you develop two personalities. You develop the one that fits into the American culture, and then you develop the one that fits into the Norwegian culture, and you become bilingual. It just happens. And you find it easier to communicate in one language or another. I spent little pockets of years in Norway where I always struggled to fit in socially, and I think not just because I didn't know how to be a Norwegian kid. I knew how to be an American kid, dragged back and forth to Norway. But I found it difficult to express who I was in Norwegian language, even though I spoke fluently, because the only conversations I had were with grown-ups, family, people who have expectations of you that the other kids don't. So I developed my own little bubble of culture where I would chameleon into the person that fit in best outside of the home. And so my own culture is something in between. And you get to resenting the time that you get dragged away in either direction to not fit into whichever culture. So every summer vacation, Norway, never time with friends. Every 17th of May, dragged out of school to parade around grounds, that sort of stuff. And that was weird for me until I went to high school. I went to high school in Scotland, where I met a lot of other third culture kids, because I went to an American school in Aberdeen, Scotland, which in a way put me in between three cultures, because most of the kids at the American school are American, so they're experiencing the same thing as me with Norway and America. The parents still trying to watch NFL every Sunday, but they're living in Scotland, where you don't have McDonald's at the time, where you don't have NFL on TV, where you don't have Oreos. We didn't, so they had the same sort of diverse sort of experienced and were dragged around, but we had a common ground to sort of experience that in. And that's where the third culture is. The third culture is where all those kids get together and can bond over that middle ground space. And it is a middle ground space, and it's hard to see how you deal with it. See, like, some of us actually went out and then experienced Scottish culture, whereas other people felt, I guess, a lot of pressure from their American side of their family, of their expectations from home, expectations from each other, that they were eventually going back to America, so they didn't integrate quite as much. Although maybe that's not a fair assessment. I'm not sure. But so you see, now there's all of a sudden another culture that you're trying to fit in with your third culture kids that you bond with at school, and then you're trying to fit into the Scottish one, and then you become more and more of a chameleon the more cultures you want to integrate into. And it's hard to make them all meld. They all sound very similar, but it's very hard to make them all meld. And then when I finally, first I tried to pick the American culture, went to American university, and discovered that that didn't fit, really, because I'd done the Scottish thing, even though I went to American school. And I thought, well, I'll go back to what I am. I am Norwegian, even though I have a U.S. passport. I am Norwegian. I was taught I'm Norwegian. I am from Norway. And you go back to Norway and you try so hard to be Norwegian culture. But there are parts of you that just don't get it. And you want to fit all those parts of all the other cultures that you've had into the new life, and you want to teach all your other, I want to show you guys how amazing it can be to like integrate cultures, and you just end up being weird. And that's not necessarily a really good thing, you know. If you just end up being weird, that's not always what people, I guess, respond to in any sort of real way. They just realize that you are not quite like them. This is not a pity party. I'm blessed to have experienced all these things. But you get this conflicting loyalty. I support the Scottish rugby team when I'm not supporting the All Blacks, which is a different story because my husband's from New Zealand and I also have an Australian passport and I'm moving to New Zealand, so it's sort of an international thing. And any ski event, I will support Norway. Any Scottish thing, I will rise up and become Scottish. I mean, these are high school years. I will defend Norway to the death, but I never want to live there again because I can't make it mesh with the culture that I have. And so the blessing is that you get to experience all these things and you get to identify with all these things. The difficulty is that you become an expert at trying to fit in, right, with all these cultures. You try to play fantasy football when you're in America. You try to do the skiing holidays and mountaineering when you're in Norway. When you're in Scotland, you hang out with your rocker friends and listen to obscure Scottish bands like Marillion, and on Facebook you talk about any time Scottish independence comes up, and you never get to share it with your new friends who don't have the third culture. You can explain all you want that you support the All Blacks, but they can't quite see it. So you develop, this sounds kind of arrogant, but you develop this kind of ability to uh, see and understand other people's cultures, and you adapt to them, but they will never understand parts, big parts of you that you can't share with them. And you want to. You want to share it. You want to have it out there with them. So it's a big part of understanding me. I get you. Arrogant, right? I get you. But you can never get me. Not as much as I can get you. I can explain it till I'm blue in the face, but it becomes a little lonely when you want to share everything with everybody. So that's my experience of being a third culture child. I'm not sure. I'm not sure that explains it, but that's a third culture child. It's a child who has the blessing of feeling connected to a lot of cultures. And imagine people who like come from vastly different cultures. I mean, mine are all Western cultures, even though they're still all different. But imagine the feelings that people who come from vastly opposing cultures must feel in this space. I don't know. My plea to have you understand me. Feel free to ask me questions about it. You know, I'm choosing to love the bits I love about each culture. I'm choosing to live in New Zealand as a hermit, and I'm choosing to hope that my continuing to reach out will one day be a connection. Okay, I'm going to take a quick break there, and then quick break, and then I'm going to stop talking about third culture kids and talk about a second topic, unless somebody comes home real quick, and then I'm screwed and have to live dashboard. What's the live dashboard? Why can't I get to the control room? So I'm going to take a quick little break right here, and then I want to create a highlight. I want to create a break control room, advanced settings, live control room. And I want to talk about something completely different. And where is that? Can I pause it?